Thank you for the repeat invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Mendelian randomization, going back to the start. Although I don't know how to move the PowerPoints, so that's apart from that, I'm set up.
You want to go next slide?
Yeah, how do I move? So now they'll move, yeah. Perfect, that's brilliant, yeah. So Mendelian randomization, what it was, well, Mendelian randomization was really introduced because of the sort of dramatic failure of conventional observational epidemiological approaches, which identified things as being, either causal, increasing the risk of disease or reducing the risk of disease. And then when randomized trials were done, large-scale randomized trials were done, this failed to be realized. So, for example, vitamin E supplements, observationally protected, but randomized trials were done, no protection whatsoever. The same was seen for many other vitamins, for hormone replacement therapy, all these things. And it really was a dramatic moment in epidemiology. Shah Ibrahim and I, when we took over editing the International Journal of Epidemiology, we wrote an editorial called Epidemiology, Is It Time to Call It a Day? Because things did really seem dire. And we used this cartoon, which I'm sure you've all seen. The newsreader says, according to the headlines, today's random medical news from the New England Journal of Panic-Inducing Gobbledygook, presses the button, these things spin round, and he says, coffee causes depression in twins. That's today's story. And of course, every one of these is spurious, except red wine does cause sexual dysfunction in men aged 25 to 40. That is definitely causal, but I'm basing that on very old memories, obviously. So, conventional observational epidemiology measures your exposure, and then it follows people up, usually, or does case control studies, but of course, there's confounding and reverse causation. Early stages of the disease, like early stages of atherosclerosis, increase your C-reactive protein because it's an inflammatory condition. So you have confounding and reverse causation, and statistical methods just don't work. Adjustment doesn't work. Impossible to exclude those. So the trick in Mendelian randomization is that if you have a genetic variable, for example, a single nucleotide polymorphism, a SNP, in the LDL receptor gene that relates to cholesterol level, then of course there will not be reverse causation because the early stages of disease cannot influence your germline genetic variant, the variant you were born with, and there will not be conventional confounding by all the sort of lifestyle factors, socioeconomic position, health-related behaviors that confound observational studies. So you just simply look at the joint association of the genetic variant with the outcome, and you divide that by the genetic variant and your exposure, and that gives you what's called an instrumental variable estimate of the causal effect of your exposure, cholesterol on coronary heart disease. So improves causal inference. Now, the fundamental assumption in Mendelian randomization, and I think this is often forgotten, is that of gene-environment equivalence. And by that, what we mean is that it doesn't matter if your cholesterol level is influenced by a counterfactual change in your germline genome. Counterfactually, you could imagine that replacement could be done and your cholesterol level would change. Or if your cholesterol level is higher because you live on sausages, they would both produce the same downstream effect through the change in cholesterol on coronary heart disease. Now, we have plenty of examples of gene-environment equivalence in Mendelian genetics. So, for example, you have a condition, pellagra, which is caused by long-term deficiency of niacin, vitamin B3. And that condition looks like a monogenic genetic condition called Hartnupp's disorder. And Hartnupp's disorder modifies your niacin level through poor absorption of amino acid tryptophan, which is converted to niacin. So they both produce a change in niacin level, and they produce a very similar phenotype. the differential diagnosis of polygramous heart-lung disease and vice versa, and heart-lung disease is rare. So that's an example of gene-environment equivalence. And in developmental genetics, this is just common sense. I mean, Mary Jane West Eberhardt's brilliant book on developmental genetics refers to gene-environment equivalence and gene-environment interchangeability. Doesn't matter what's influencing gene expression, that will have the same downstream phenotypic effects. Well, Zucker, Candle, and Ville published a well-known paper in PNAS where they said, no doubt all environmental effects can be mimicked by one or several mutations. Now, I think this is true for the endogenous processes generating disease, like, cholesterol level. And for many disease situations, it's probably not true by being hit by a truck. You probably don't have a genetic variant that mimics the effects of being hit by a truck, but for most disease processes, it's correct. So that gene-environment equivalence is key. Now, let's take an example of gene-environment equivalence, thinking of LDL cholesterol or non-HDL cholesterol and the risk of coronary heart disease in drug trials. How equivalent are the drug trials and the genetic studies? Now, the difference is, of course, the drug trials, will randomize you to a statin, say, for 5 years. And that will mean that the group who get randomized to the statins have a lower level of cholesterol on average for 5 years compared to the group not. The genetic variants will relate to your cholesterol level from birth onwards. And we know that atherosclerosis is a cumulative process. So you wouldn't expect the actual risk estimates would be the same for the same difference in cholesterol, because with the genetic variants, you've had that difference in cholesterol for 60 years before you enter the trial. In the randomized trials, it's just 5 years. But what you see is this rather beautiful scaling. And this is situations where we know where the gene and the environment are obviously equivalent, because you're looking, the environmental factor of the statin, of course, inhibits HMG-CoA reductase. And you can have genetic variants in HMG-CoA reductase, which relate to higher cholesterol level or lower cholesterol level. And the drug trials, actually, 5 years of treatment gets you about 35 to 40% of the effect estimates seen in the genetic studies. So the MR estimates are larger because in this case, they're relating to the cumulative effects of cholesterol over a long period. So it's crucial that you think about gene environment equivalence when doing a Mendelian randomization study. So requires justifying in all situations, and it relates to the biological processes that are influenced by the genetic variation. So consider body mass index as a phenotype. So there's genetic variant in FTO, the first common genetic variant that related to a body mass index level. That in ALSPAC was shown to relate to a higher calorie intake. So now, there is a sort of equivalence between this and calorie intake, which influences body mass index. Some influence physical activity level. But in the sort of comic example often used about, if you chop your leg off, I would reduce my body mass index quite substantially by chopping one of my legs off, but it's unlikely that's going to reduce my coronary heart disease risk. So no, chopping a leg, losing a leg is not equivalent to the genetic change in your BMI or anything you would want to do to change your BMI. And one of the hits for body mass index is a nicotine receptor leading to heavier smoking. That really does put your weight down. That's true, but you don't think that would be equivalent of manipulating body mass index in a way you want to. I'm going to go on to this terrible flood of papers, of Mendelian randomization papers. In all of those cases, if one had thought about gene environment equivalence, whether it was plausible or possible, the large majority of those papers would never get published or be performed. So a classic MR example for going on about Mendelian randomization, what it was looking at C-reactive protein and cardiometabolic disease. Nick Timpson led there had been a couple of papers before, but Nick Timpson led the first high-profile paper of C-reactive protein and its role in metabolic syndrome that was published in The Lancet in 2005, so that's 20 years ago. And at the same time, In 2005, we held the first international meeting on Mendelian randomization in Brno. And here we are standing around Mendel's statue. Here is a very young Nick Timpson, the youngest person there, and Regine, who's here today, is the second youngest person who was at that meeting 20 years ago. Anyway, this is work from a consortium led by Steve Burgess that then put all the studies together, including the study Nick was involved in, the few coronary events in that one, looking at C-reactive protein and coronary heart disease. Now, this is the phenotypic effect. Just measured C-reactive protein is related to 50% higher risk of coronary heart disease for a standard deviation. When you adjust for all the confounders that were measured, that reduced by about a third. But remained, significant. You should never say significant, but it remained statistically robust. And there was a lot of hope that modifying CRP might reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. There was some discussion of it as being the new cholesterol. And this is how the C-reactive protein related to confounders in that consortium. Basically, anything bad, like being older, that is really bad, having a higher BMI, etc., or smoking, they were all related to higher C-reactive protein. So you had all these factors that would mean that you would expect C-reactive protein would predict coronary heart disease, which indeed it did. But when you adjusted for all these, it remained an elevated risk. When you look at a promoter region variant for CRP that was available in all the studies, it related very strongly statistically to C-reactive protein. Not a huge difference, but it was an extremely robust difference. But it did not relate to any of the confounders. So with this single variant, MR was doing what it said on the tin, which is that the genetic variant would not relate to the confounding factors. And when the Mendelian randomization was done, then what was found was that the predicted causal effect was null, completely null, i.e. there's no actual causal increase of in coronary heart disease in relation to higher C-reactive protein. And the important thing from this PowerPoint, this slide, is that this is what you see for something which is totally non-causal. This is what you expect to see. When you adjust for all the confounders, it only reduces by 30–40%. Ridiculous story about butter out today. A few weeks ago, it was dark chocolate. All of these nutritional studies, they have results that are exactly like that. You adjust for things, and then people say, "Oh, it's causal." That is what you expect for null effects. That's what a null effect looks like. You can do Mendelian randomization bidirectionally in both directions. This is again Nick Timpson's work using FTO, which, as we said, you can think about the gene environment equivalence. Yeah, that's reasonable to investigate the effect of BMI on CRP, and your body mass index increases your C-reactive protein. So that shows, when you think about it, the structure of that is you're actually demonstrating that this is a causal confounder. BMI does increase your CRP, and obviously it increases the risks of lots of other things, so it will generate confounding. Just think of the simple DAG. But also you've got to note that FTO associates with CRP, but through BMI, and we'll come back to this important fact later. Then if you then do CRP onto BMI, then it's null. And this is a promoter region variant, which relates to higher levels of CRP, but nothing else. So again, that's reasonably equivalent to thinking of any way of like pharmaceutically manipulating CRP, for example. So gene environment equivalence is reasonable. Important in our findings, even though this was shown well before this, that HDL cholesterol did not protect against coronary heart disease. This paper had the major impact. It was a large collaborative venture showing that HDL didn't protect against coronary heart disease. But you have Mendelian randomization, and when Shah and I published the first paper on this, most of the examples did not use the genetic variants as instrumental variables and did not perform IV estimation, because you can use Mendelian randomization principles, the special properties, the randomized properties of genotypes, in situations where the genotype doesn't relate to your exposure, when that modifies the effects of your exposure, for example. So this is looking at the NA2 slow acetylation genotype, which the acetylation gets rid of the carcinogenic factors causing bladder cancer in tobacco smoke. And if you're looking never smokers, that genotype doesn't relate to bladder cancer. But you look in smokers, and the genotype does relate to bladder cancer because it's relating to the bin that there being greater levels of carcinogens, greater toxicity. The genotype does not relate to smoking. The definition of an instrumental variable, the three principles I'll go through. The first one is that the genetic variant must reliably associate with the exposure. In this situation, the genotype does not associate with the exposure, but it gives you powerful evidence about the causal effect of smoking, even though it doesn't relate to smoking. So MR, in my view, is not synonymous with IV. It is now usually implemented in an IV setting, but it doesn't need to be. So what types of MR studies are now carried out? So you can have situations where the exposure is in summary data or individual level data, and the outcome is in individual data or summary data. The very early MR studies were all single sample MR, like Nick Timpson's Lancet CRP study, for example. But now the large majority of MR studies use summary data or two sample MR. So that's this is the study type: summary data for exposure, summary data for outcome, two sample Mendelian randomization, or noodles, as I call most two sample MR studies. If you have individual data for the outcome and individual data from the same study from the exposure, then that would be a classic one sample MR study. But if you generate the instrument exposure data from the sample that you then apply it to, the instrument exposure effect, then you get overfitting. And that's why C-Fang introduced a sort of jackknife approach, which allows you to generate the instrument exposure effect, say in 90% of the sample, then you apply it to 10% and estimate the instrument outcome. You do that 10 times, meta-analyze the effects, and then you don't get overfitting. A lot of studies today, those using UK Biobank, for example, or Million Vets, they're sort of hybrid because they take external estimates of the genetic variant and the exposure, and then they apply that to a data set and analyze the data set as a longitudinal study or whatever. So that's a sort of hybrid form, and UK Biobank has generated a sort of rush of that. And I tried to think of the individual exposure and summary data for outcome, and I think that's very rare. Well, sort of unicorn study, they don't really exist. So where did the name come from? Well, this was my first publication I was on, which actually mentioned Mendelian randomization with data. I'd mentioned it in BMJ editorials and stuff as a notion before this. But this was in 2001, sorry, when we had done a study of homocysteine, which folate lowers homocysteine and cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease in the Caffulli study, and we showed that homocysteine did indeed predict coronary heart disease, but when you adjusted for the confounders, it attenuated by 40–50%. And then we said, applying some work Andy Phillips and I had done on measurement error, we said, this makes it very likely that effect actually would go down to null if you were actually taking into account measurement error and the confounders and maybe some missing confounders. So we said we weren't convinced of any of the causal effect of that. Then some folate enthusiasts wrote in and sort of attacked our paper, and it was there and then what we did then is took estimates from a study of using the MTHFR gene, which was related to homocysteine levels, and how that gene related to coronary heart disease in another set of data, and calculated what would now be called a Wald ratio, but with misspecified standard errors, because I didn't realize this was a Wald estimate, didn't think of Mendelian randomization as instrumental variables at all, even though I taught instrumental variables in the School of Hygiene. Anyway, and said that, the estimates, we need larger studies, but it's lower than the observational effect. And then said that either through Mendelian randomization and used the term Mendelian randomization. And that term came from a paper I'd read many years before by Richard Gray and Keith Wheatley about when they termed Mendelian randomization a truly ingenious method of evaluating bone marrow transplantation. But this was not by using any molecular genetic data. It was using a sibling study. And it was an ingenious method, because they were talking about children with myeloblastic leukemia, for example. Now the survival from that was very poor in those days, and parents wouldn't want their children to be randomized into a study of bone marrow transplant when that was really the sort of only hope. And what Gray and Wheatley pointed out was that as the most frequent provider of those transplants was a sibling, if you consider the children with no genetically compatible sibling, many fewer of those would get a transplant. If you had the children who had a sibling with a genetically compatible, HLA compatible sibling, they were much more likely to get a transplant. So if you actually analyze by whether you had an HLA compatible sibling or not, that was like an intention to treat analysis within a randomized trial, but using observational data. And the randomization was the Mendelian randomization of having an HLA compatible sibling. So that was a sort of brilliant notion, but it wasn't something that could be done in many situations. It was very specific to this bone marrow transplant situation. But that was the earliest one I'd seen in 2001. But since then, because of the ability to search and find things, I discovered there are actually earlier reports. This one again just postulated that this could be done. It didn't actually report data on it, but they referred to this as biological randomization, the availability of a matched sibling donor. It's possible or probable that Buckley et al. Might have heard it from Graham Wheatley, who were talking about it before they published. But that was the first place. But they referred to it as biological randomization. There was papers referring to meiotic randomization, because of course the randomization is during meiosis. Talked about genotypic randomization. Talked about genetically randomized comparisons. So if I'd seen any of those papers, I always like looking back at the history. I wouldn't have used the term Mendelian randomization. I would have used the one from the earliest paper that I'd found. And maybe Mendelian randomization would have fared better as, I don't know, biological meiotic randomization. I think the term Mendelian randomization sort of pissed some people off. So maybe it's a shame that was the name that it ended with. Now, when Shah and I introduced this, we introduced it within a family study context. So we were saying that Mendelian randomization is clearly seen in parent-offspring designs when you truly are looking at how meiosis leads to the randomization, the literal randomization of genotypes to offspring. And we drew a diagram for this sort of design. But then at that time, there was very few data that allowed you to do this sort of parent-offspring or within SibShip sorts of analyses. So then we said, well, don't have those data, but at a population level, there will be approximate randomization. So we should probably have stuck to the term approximate MR or AMR, but that's antimicrobial resistance now, of course. But again, it probably would have led to less sort of abreactions to the Mendelian randomization idea, was that it is clearly only approximate in population studies. Duncan Thomas was the first person I saw in writing to point out that this was just simply an incidental variable analysis. He wrote a commentary that Shah and I asked for the International Journal of Epidemiology, and he very nicely attributed it to us, but we hadn't said this at all. And I read this and thought, how stupid! I didn't realize this was an incidental variable. it was basically an instrumental variable setup. It did feel very stupid. So instrumental variables, I've already sort of introduced this. You have Z, which is the instrumental, the genetic variant. It must relate to the exposure. That is the relevance assumption. That one you can test statistically. The other two you can't test statistically. The second assumption is that there's no confounding between the instrument and the outcome or exchangeability. Now, you've got an arrow pointing at Z. So how does that work? That's your germline genotype. But of course, this is a sort of probabilistic diagram. You're sort of saying, does the confounder relate to the actual distribution of Z in the population? And of course, the obvious confounder in that sense is population stratification or ancestry differences when you have sort of mixed ancestries within a single population and you don't realize that. And because there's different frequencies of genetic variance between the ancestries and also different frequencies of disease outcomes for other reasons, not because of that genetic variation differences, you will get confounding. The other form of that looks like confounding, which leads Z not to be independent of Y, would be dynastic effects. And the dynastic effects are when your parental genotype, the genotype your parents have, which obviously influences your genotype. You know, if your gene is 50% sampling of your parents' alleles, the parental genotype obviously influences your genotype, and your parental genotype could sort of influence either the exposure or the outcome. And this was the only really good example of parent-offspring Mendelian randomization Shah and I could find in 2003, and I still think it's one of the best examples there is of Mendelian randomization. This is considering folate with homocysteine being lowered by the folate. Folate activity in mothers and fathers in relation to neural tube defects in offspring. Of course, we know that randomizing pregnant women, especially if you start early, randomizing pregnant women to folate or before pregnancy reduces the risk of neural tube defects in the children. Now, the MTHFR genotype, at that time, there was no studies that really had measured folate activity in relation to MTHFR genotype, but that has now been done, and the MTHFR does indeed relate to folate activity. And if your mother is homozygous for the variant related to lower folate activity, you have a relative risk of 2 of developing neural tube defects. You have the beautiful negative control, which is the father, because of course the father's genotype cannot influence the intrauterine environment, so it's a perfect negative control, and the father's genotype does indeed not relate to the neural tube defect risk, but the genotype of the fetus does, but only because the fetus will have half of the alleles are from the mum. Now, if you were doing MR and you just had the fetal genotype, you would somehow think it was like it was the fetal folate intake or whatever that was influencing the neural tube defects, which of course is not the case. So the dynastic effects can work through like intrauterine environment, as in that case, or they could work, through, for example, if you have a parental genotype that relates to drinking more alcohol, then maybe you grow up in a situation where your parents are drinking more alcohol. Might make you more likely or might make you less likely, but it might influence your alcohol drinking, or the same with smoking. What if your parents have genotypes related to higher educational attainment? There might be more books in the house, those sorts of things. So in those situations, your genotype might not be independent of X, and therefore Y of X causes Y because of these dynastic effects, which have often been forgotten in MR. And then the third assumption is of no horizontal pleiotropy being the genetic variant influences the outcome, and it's not through the exposure. Now, the economists, it's referred to as the exclusion restriction, and they refer to this as Z is independent of Y, conditional on X and C. And you think, oh God, that's terrible. The whole point of Mendelian randomization is that it avoids confounding. So why is it conditional on X and C? And it's conditional on X and C because you should never condition on the intermediate phenotype in MR. Some very early MR studies said, well, we can test this because what we can do is we can just adjust for cholesterol and see if the genetic variant still influences the outcome, even if you adjust for cholesterol, and that would be a test of the exclusion restriction. Now that doesn't work, and that doesn't work because firstly, there's measurement error in your phenotype. You just have a one-off measure of your cholesterol level, so there'll be residual effects because you're not fully adjusting for it. But secondly, if you adjust for X, then you are conditioning on a collider. And so to give a very quick sketch of what adjusting for a collider involves. So let's imagine you're in a sort of US university where they have scholarships for people who get very high SAT scores, people who do very well academically, and they have scholarships for sports scholarships for if you're really good at American football. So you can get into the college. Imagine you can get into the college either through a SAT score scholarship or through an athletic scholarship. Now, imagine in the population there is no association between sporting prowess and academic ability. They're completely unassociated. But if you walked onto one of these campuses and you saw one of the students over there and you sort of toss them a ball, and they sort of try to catch the ball, and they fall over backwards, the ball bounces off their head, you can go up to them and very confidently say, you are really clever. Because they're not there because of a sporting scholarship. So that is precisely what adjusting on a collider does. You adjust for something which are influenced by two factors, even if those two factors don't associate in the overall population, they will associate once you adjust. So that's why you should not adjust for the intermediate phenotype. So I say horizontal pleiotropy. Genes always have to work through phenotypes. So the horizontal pleiotropy will be working through some phenotype, but you don't know what that phenotype is. Now, they have different names, but there's two types of pleiotropy, two broad categories of pleiotropy. Either horizontal pleiotropy, which is where the genetic variant has its influence not through the exposure, or you have vertical pleiotropy. Vertical pleiotropy is when the genetic variant influences body mass index, say, and then body mass index influences CRP. So vertical pleiotropy is Mendelian randomization. So when you see papers that say there's a vast amount of pleiotropy in the human genome, which there undoubtedly is, a large chunk of that pleiotropy is vertical pleiotropy. And vertical pleiotropy is not, when you actually know what the phenotypes are, is not only not a problem, it's precisely why you can do Mendelian randomization. Mendelian randomization exploits vertical pleiotropy. But as I say, if things work through phenotypes, when the genetic variant is working through some phenotypes before it influences the phenotype of interest, which generally it'll be doing unless you're looking at expressions, say, then that's fine as long as the factors that it's working through don't influence your outcome. So mediated vertical pleiotropy is fine, but if you don't know what this is, and this does influence your outcome, then you're stuffed. So I remember I talked about doing Mendelian randomization of BMI onto CRP, and FTO is indeed genome-wide significant variant for CRP. If you took FTO to be an instrument for CRP, you'd get the wrong answer because FTO relates to BMI and BMI relates to the outcome. Okay, so interpreting IV estimates, you need all the assumptions. The exposure period might be like lifetime for the cholesterol level. The exposure period might just be through a critical period, like very early in life or something. and your genetic variants relate to your exposure level, your vitamin D level, or whatever, right the way across your life. But your vitamin D might only protect against multiple sclerosis around puberty or something. So you don't know what the exposure period is in Mendelian randomization. You don't know when the active exposure period is. Generally, IV estimates relate to disease occurrence because most of the GWASs are of having a disease, having a lung cancer or whatever, not of disease progression. If you want to do Mendelian randomization for therapeutics, you need data on disease progression. Now, there's tons of sensitivity analyses, which I'm not going to talk about. One thing which, though, that I think a good sensitivity analysis is underused is the use of negative controls. So here's an example of negative controls in relation to the relationship between alcohol consumption and cardiovascular disease. Newspapers love it when you see studies saying that alcohol reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. They always get in the news. This was a recent paper, relatively recent paper. This got sort of covered, in the Guardian. Moderate drinking can lower risk of heart attack, study says. Bit down market, the Independent newspaper, drinking a pint of beer a day reduced risk of heart attack. Further down market, the Daily Mail, cheers, drinkers who have one glass of wine a night got less risk of a heart attack. Right, gutter press, drinking alcohol slashes risk of heart problems if you drink this much per week. Rather sober from Time, alcohol's good for your heart most of the time. My favourite one, is the Irish Times, moderate drinking may cut risk of heart disease, which is, may cut, that's a good story. Moderate drinking may be good for your heart, and even heavy drinking may lower your heart attack risks. So you can do Mendelian randomization of alcohol because there are genetic variants that relate to alcohol metabolism, but in particular, ADH, alcohol dehydrogenase, metabolizes ethanol to acetaldehyde, which gives you all the nasty effects of alcohol. So it gives you like palpitations, you get flushing, you get headaches, you get guilt. Actually, no, the guilt isn't part of that, but anyway, you get all those unpleasant things. And in East Asian populations, a lot of people carry a null variant, a literal null variant in this gene. So some people are homozygous for this gene, and they flush instantly and very quickly on drinking alcohol. It's very unpleasant, they don't drink. And some people are heterozygous. Now, in these populations at the time, some of these studies were done that we got many years ago, women were not drinking, hardly drinking at all, independent of their genotype. So this gives you a beautiful negative control or zero relevance point group. Because if the genetic effect is through pleiotropy, then you will see the genetic effect, you'll see that effect in women and in men. But if it's actually purely through drinking alcohol, you'll only see it in men. And you see the women are not drinking whatever their genotype, the men are drinking according to genotype. And what you see, the really bad news, is that the men who are homozygous for the knockout and don't drink have considerably lower blood pressure than the ones who are homozygous wild type. In the women, there's no association between genetic variants and blood pressure. And now with vastly more data, the same thing's been shown. So that tells you that this is not pleiotropy that's generating this effect. And in the Kadoorie study, using a very large sample size, you could actually compare the observational associations, where you see the J-shaped curve that moderate drinking appeared to be protective. This is for stroke, but then stratifying on sex, which relates to alcohol consumption, and also 10 regions where there's big regional differences in alcohol consumption. One in Kadoorie study, some of these regions have large Muslim populations, for example. You could then get groups who drank very different amounts at a group level and use the genetic variant within those groups, and you see there's just a linear adverse effect on stroke of alcohol consumption. Like when I was in Glasgow, I used to drink old mortality beer. I can't go back to this company and sue them for this when I got a stroke, because they told me that's what happened. As I say, there's tons of methods papers. I'm not going to talk about them. Sensitivity analyses. The template for these is the introduction says current methods have limitations. Then it says we simulate data and apply our new method and a handful of previous methods to these results. Our method performs best. Conclusion, we are the champions. So that's what all of those sensitivity analyses papers show. So Mendelian randomization, what is it? what is it now? So I'm actually going to skip sclerostin. It's a nice story, but if anyone's very interested in sclerostin, I'll talk to them about sclerostin. I'll only talk about one sort of current set of data that I'm interested in. I like the sclerostin, but multivariable Mendelian randomization allows you to look at more than one phenotype and then taking into account the relationship between those phenotypes. So you can actually look at like body size across life. And this has been done with prepubertal BMI age 10, and then adulthood BMI. And you can do nice positive controls. So using ALSPAC data, we showed that childhood BMI, the childhood BMI score does indeed relate to adulthood BMI, adulthood vitamin D, as does adulthood score. But when you take the adulthood score into account, the childhood score no longer relates. It's the adult vitamin D which influences your adult BMI that influences your adult vitamin D. And then the same is the case that it's your childhood BMI that influences your childhood vitamin D and ALSPAC. So you can do positive controls. And then when you do these multivariable MR on coronary heart disease, you see that it's just adulthood coronary heart, BMI that counts. But when you do body size effects on fractures in later life, it's the childhood age 10 body size which is protecting against fractures. And the adult body size actually is adverse once you take the childhood BMI into account. And this is working through bone mineral density. And then finally, when you look at breast cancer, there's a strong observational association in the best studies of larger childhood body size and increased and decreased risk of breast cancer. And you see that protection, and that's really quite substantial protection of larger early life body size on breast cancer risk. And when you look at potential mediators, then insulin-like growth factor 1, larger childhood body size leads to lower adulthood IGF-1, which so that could mediate a proportion of this effect, a small proportion. But childhood body size, of course, brings forward age at menarche. Earlier age at menarche is related to higher risk of breast cancer. And then when you take the two into account, it makes the childhood body size effect and the age at menarche body effect become larger. So these are working through two particular mechanisms. And looking at breast density, the breast density does mediate a quite substantial effect. But of course, that then begs the question, what is this breast density indicating? But this is a really sort of interesting, to me, very interesting result, which really does give a window into breast cancer etiology. Okay, but MR, how is it really? Or Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Gabriel Garcia Marquez paper. When two-sample Mendelian randomization was just becoming popular, Fernando Hartwig wrote a paper about the problems with two-sample MR. And that paper demonstrates, in his paper, he showed how a recently published, quite high-profile study was fallacious, leading to the first retraction of a Mendelian randomization paper. And basically, all two-sample MR have been done. There's a program Tom Gaunt generated called Epigraph DB, and with things that with summary data, you can just look in there and you can see any two-sample MR analysis you want. But of course, these two-sample Mendelian randomization papers have just absolutely taken off. This is sort of a true exponential in the numbers of papers. This is Mendelian randomization in the title, and this is per week. 100 papers per week with Mendelian randomization in the title. If you project forward, in about 27 months' time, every single scientific paper in the world will be a Mendelian randomization paper. And of course, these are the ones that I would call noodles. I mean, that was on Twitter, X, no one's on anymore. This became a paper about noodle intake, the idea you could instrument noodle intake. Rather ridiculous, but this actually was a well-done paper. What it did was okay. It was just that the gene environment equivalence assumption is just clearly nonsense, as it is with COVID on cancer risk. When the cancer risk data were from before, collected before the pandemic, or the GWAS, which lipid lowering drug you're on, particulate matter, they're GWASing your address and using your address to assign air pollution, which is ridiculous. or a bit anyway. Many of these papers do come from China, and this is from translated from a Chinese website where you can basically buy papers, and they then say, you know, we get you in a journal with 15.3 impact factor. This is the advert is saying we got this paper for you. You know, you don't write it, that you pay to get these papers published, and you get a discount if you buy more than one paper, and you can do them in minutes. And you see these clusters of papers. This is gut microbiome and erectile dysfunction. Who would think anyone would publish on that? Well, the same bloody thing. Gut microbiome on erectile dysfunction. There's not just one MR paper on it, there's tons. That's noodles. They're terrible. The second thing is there's no longer any nulls in Mendelian randomization. The important Mendelian randomization findings were the nulls like CRP, like HDL cholesterol, like fibrinogen, etc. You don't see any nulls published anymore. That's the no nulls. And thirdly is that these really complex methods, that we are the champions type methods, which the people who are using them, people who are developing them maybe don't really understand them. And take this, here's the case of vitamin D, where the earlier MR, vitamin D was a pin-up because the MR was the approach which showed no effects on many common causes of disease were expected, and the randomized trials did indeed show no benefit. But a nonlinear Mendelian randomization method was developed, statistical manipulation, and the residual method, where you took out the genetic component of the phenotype in the different strata and applied MR. Sounds good, sounds sensible. And what that did was lead to results which looked like the observational estimates. They just looked straightforwardly like the observational estimates, which is a bit suspicious. But what's more suspicious was that they published results like this. Remember, the overall is null, and they published in each of the strata. There's benefit in each of the strata, and yet the overall effect is null. Now, people have a sort of vague memory of sort of Simpson's paradox and think, well, maybe that can happen. If you actually consider the assumptions of Mendelian randomization, that these are causal estimates, and the data are distributed as you know the data are, and you think the MR assumptions are true, this is literally impossible. These findings are literally impossible. You just recapitulate observational findings. So a new method was developed, which did, once one of this has been pointed out, which did indeed, using the new method, suggest there wasn't an effect. But you could have seen there was no effect by doing negative control analyses, because what you see is that vitamin D alters your sex. You know, you just replace death as your outcome and you do sex as your outcome. Yeah, vitamin D changes your sex and it changes your age. You know, these sort of things could happen, and the papers retracted the commentary. The authors retracted the commentary that accompanied it, and they republished a null paper saying that their original results were a logical impossibility. A very similar paper was published by a different group using largely the same data, UK Biobank data. This was the press release on it, the sunshine vitamin that delivers on cardio health. It was then said it's not ethical to recruit people with vitamin D deficiency to a randomized controlled trial and to leave them without treatment for long periods on the basis of our genetic approach shows this. This is the exact antithesis of what Mendelian randomization was introduced for, which was to get the right answers on things like vitamins, but to use it to say that randomized trials aren't necessary is, I think, not a great way of communicating science. The paper's been retracted a few weeks ago. I haven't seen a press release going out to point out that the paper had been retracted. And then you go back to some other famous nulls like HDL cholesterol. These non-linear methods recapitulate the observational effects, and again they find an overall null with most of the strata showing very considerable benefits. So now Mendelian randomization is saying HDL cholesterol, higher HDL cholesterol will reduce your risk of coronary heart disease. Well, we know that that's not true. So underlying these is just partly underlying these are just the larger and larger GWAS, which means more and more of your genetic variants for a phenotype like CRP are things like FTO, which will influence CRP through BMI. And this is the CRP variant confounders that I showed you. Dan Russoff now looked at the current the score using genome-wide significant variants combined for CRP in UK Biobank, and it relates to all the confounders. So if you use all the variants, you just go straight back to the confounded estimates, because your genetic variants there are genetic variants for BMI, for smoking, etc., because they relate to that phenotype. So if you consider in relation to gene environment equivalence, the CRP promoter region variant is possibly equivalent to sort of circulating level of CRP you could influence with pharmaceuticals, but BMI or smoking or IL-6 or just anonymous trans variants are unlikely to be reliable instruments. Okay, so what should be done? So journals shouldn't send out for review two-sample MR findings reported without triangulation or other evidence. Reviewers should refuse to review such. If you have to review these, there's a standard letter that Stefan Stender put in an editorial, which he write to the editors saying why you're not going to review them. Journals should only send out for review papers that have filled out the Strobe MR checklist, and that the checklist should be completed, because the check should be then ensure that it actually has been applied, because one of those points is you must justify the gene environment equivalence assumption. Most papers don't. It's got to be reviewed, and the methods should be more rigorously evaluated before implementation, including through use of negative and positive controls. So what should it become? So I think Mendelian randomization should always be presented within a triangulation of evidence framework as one aspect of the evidence. And in fact, the most influential MR studies now are not MR studies. They're not papers that have MR in the title. They are, for example, GWAS papers, which now most GWAS papers will have a follow-up, will do follow-up Mendelian randomization to see how the phenotype they're looking at might influence other things. And then they'll put that forward as hypotheses that can be looked at. Or it's MR studies done in the pharmaceutical industry, which aren't published, but actually, just help make decisions about taking things forward when you put it together with all the other evidence you have. So it should be triangulation of evidence. Should reconnect with biology and cease to be just a mechanical application of IV analysis. I think many of the really good MR examples are with interactions. I think there's a big future for doing MR with interactions with genotypes that you know what they actually do biologically, how they modify the effect of a phenotype. I think MR should be used to contribute to the collection of appropriate data. So e.g. clinical cohort collections for disease progression, and that's what you require it. And then you need MR methods to take into account the inherent collider bias that you get if you start with people who all of whom have a particular disease. Should be applied to questions of natural selection. We did it applying it, my favorite paper for years, applying it to lactase persistence. I'm very happy to talk to anyone for hours about this if anyone's interested. Be applied to non-human life forms. There's MR of cows and the economically important phenotypes like milk production. MR applied to rice, again, economically important. I think MR principles can be used to actually look at what is causing confounding. Because take this, muesli intake may protect against coronary artery disease and Mendelian randomization. You've GBUS eating muesli. But what you can do, if you've got the observational data on that, is you can do MR of like body mass index, of smoking, of these factors onto muesli to look at the things which actually confound muesli eating with, and coronary artery disease, and then actually see, does that explain the observational associations you see? And there's a nice example from Gus Hamilton, who was looking at small HDL particles, which higher levels relate to quite considerably lower sepsis mortality. And observationally, he showed that in UK Biobank. He did do MR, and it all looked a bit null. But then he actually looked at how IL-6 receptor variant relates both to HDL cholesterol and to sepsis outcomes, and he showed that the IL-6 variant relates very strongly. It is to the MR of IL-6 pathway activity onto HDL, relates strongly to it, and also relates very strongly to sepsis. In fact, it accounts for about 50% of the association. CRP doesn't relate, IL-6, which does. So that actually, using MR to dissect confounding in observational data, I think is quite an exciting possibility. And then finally, and this is like going to Mars, it could be combined with studies of somatic mutation for a combined Mendelian and Darwinian approach to disease biology. You can do MR of like tissue specific phenotypes that might relate to clonal selection of developing tumors, and you can actually look at the mutations in the tumors that influence the tumor characteristics. And these are I don't do any of this work. These are the people who did all the work. I thank very much Richard Gray, the sadly died last year, who gave me a lot of information about the work that they'd done. If you want to read anything on MR, this Eleanor Sanderson's paper, I'd recommend Eleanor Sanderson's Nature Reviews Methods Protocols paper, Nature Reviews Methods Primer paper on MR. Shah Ibrahim and I wrote a sort of editorial, a sort of rather sad editorial about the erroneous epidemiological findings on vitamins coming full circle after 2 decades of Mendelian randomization. Or if you've got anyone who you've got to buy a present for, but you don't like them very much, then I would recommend this book, Combining Human Genetics and Causal Influence to Understand Human Disease and Development. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George, for a very provocative talk. Questions from in the room or from online? Yeah.
Thanks very much, George. Can you elaborate on your thoughts on how GWAS studies are going to create potentially more variables for analysis, but how to assess it? Yeah, you need a plausible ones to see.
Absolutely, because the truth is, there's something that Eric Turkheimer called the sort of 3 laws of behavioral genetics, and the first one is everything is heritable. And seeing as everything is heritable, like muesli eating will definitely turn out to be heritable. That means if you GWAS it, you will get genetic variants that relate to muesli intake. But the way you've got to interpret those are in my view, if you're going to try and use them for Mendelian randomization, is in the gene environment equivalence way. Is it plausible that these variables will actually influence muesli intake in a way that would have the same downstream effects, or isn't it likely that these genetic variants will be influencing muesli intake through some higher level process, educational attainment, body mass index, etc. That is clearly going to have horizontally pleiotropic effects, however good people that we are the champions sensitivity analyses, you can't deal with that. So I think the approach of just taking all the variants and thinking that because we've got a genome-wide significant hit, we'll use it unless it's obviously ridiculous. So people won't use FTO as an instrument for C-reactive protein, although quite a lot of papers do. I mean, if people actually look at the data they're putting in, they wouldn't do that because they know that it relates to a higher level phenotype. But if you think of molecular phenotypes, transcription factors, factor activity, binding, et cetera, these sort of phenotypes, which the variants might be influencing things through those phenotypes, they're almost certain to have other downstream effects other than the phenotype you're thinking of. So, in situations like circulating proteins, you often sort of think, well, we can use, promoter region variants, cis variants, which might only be influencing the protein through that, and then you do negative controls. So negative controls are really, really powerful, really underused. You should use, negative and positive controls in MR. Could be essential, but you can do those best when you've got individual level data. And also the interactions are if you've got a 0 relevance point, then that's a sort of negative control. But even if you just have some effect modification, gene by gene or G by E, some effect modification, that modification is maybe less likely to be sort of confounded, if you like, than is our main effects. So definitely using interactions more, using negative and positive controls more, and actually thinking about variant choice, I think, is key.
Just to follow up, do journals require this stage the equivalent of a strobe or other list that includes negative controls in MR?
So Strobe MR mentions them, but doesn't say you should include them. Strobe MR does say that you have to justify the gene environment equivalence assumption, but it doesn't say that. But we probably should review. We should revise Strobe MR. Strobe MR was, it's only 2 or 3 years ago, but if you saw that curve, Strobe MR was introduced before the massive takeoff of MR papers.
Michael.
So hypothetical question, let's say you're reviewing RAND applications, and you keep getting these Mendelian randomization applications, and you look and you're trying to figure out whether the proposed study meets the requirements you put out there. And it's very hard to figure it out. Like what would someone who is not actually studying themselves but reviewing other research or proposed research, what should you look for?
So firstly, if I got a grant application that was simply for doing MR, I would instantly say no, it shouldn't be funded. It should be combining it with triangulation of evidence. I think what you look for is triangulation of evidence, and then what I would look for is the plausibility of the instrumentation, the possibility of negative and of doing negative and positive controls. But I would want to see a triangulation being put in a triangulation framework.
Regina.
So I got a couple questions. I'll start with a less provocative one. So so the idea of using MR on the selective mutation is really interesting, and we've been doing some work to look at using germline and how does that relate to driver mutation and things like that. But I wonder what you think about, will MR work as nicely for tumor, a somatic mutation,
No.
as in a phenotypic situation? Because there's a lot of heterogeneities in the tumor, and how does that produce like therapeutic implications? And maybe some comments on that.
Yeah. So I said that you would be combining Mendelian and a Darwinian approach if you combine those. The Mendelian randomization would be using germline genetic variants that relate to particular aspects of tissue biology, of local tissue biology. Now, we haven't got good studies of that. I mean, there's a lot. The largest study I know now is about 1,400 sort of buccal cancer lines when they've actually been able to look at the clones which have taken off, etc. So it's going to start to approach being able to do that. But so that is the Mendelian randomization aspect of it. The second point, and as I said, this is like landing on the moon, but in 50 years' time, I certainly won't be around to see it. Is that basically, virtually every mutation that can occurs in a single cell in you. So you would then actually be looking to see, which clones survive through the mutations, but that would be looking at the evolution of the clones. It would be looking at a Darwinian phenomenon. It wouldn't be using the sort of randomized principles of the genetic variants that the MR is. So it's a combined approach. It's only one part of it would be MR.
And the other sort of approach that's still emerging is DMR, which is trying to use the MR approach to do genetically assessing the variability of the phenotypic variations after accounting for the genetic backgrounds. And so are there certain...
Sorry, you have to explain that more slowly. So it's D, what does D stand for?
Mendelian.
Okay, biomarker demendelization. Yeah, so that is in principle interesting, but our preprint, which introduced the term, hasn't advanced from a preprint, which was because we discovered problems. Okay. So to explain it, the notion is that if you have a phenotype, you're trying to use it as a predictor. You're not actually trying to look at it as a cause of disease, but you're trying to say, how can I get better prediction of disease? Then, if you know that the predictor isn't a cause, then you want to remove the genetic component, because the genetic component will relate to some of the variation in the predictor, and that component of the variation will not relate to the disease, because your Mendelian randomization has shown has demonstrated that. So if you have a genetic variant which explains a sort of a considerable proportion of the variance in a particular phenotype, particular predictor, then you could, in principle, make the predictor better. And we thought, well, it must work. It seemed sensible. So, and then looked at it with I think YKL something or other. It's an obscure protein produced from the lungs, which predicts bad health outcomes. And it's one of those where there is a common variant. It's like Gilbert's syndrome, for bilirubin, where you have a common variant which explains quite a lot of the variance in that. So when you take it, when you demendelize it, you just get the residuals. It should predict better, but it doesn't. So it didn't. And then it took a while to realize that why that was that because in sick people, it was a cis variant, but in sick people it related to a bigger difference in the predictor, in the protein. So even though the protein wasn't causal, that interaction, if you like, was actually helping prediction. So if you demendalized it, you removed the interaction. So in principle, it's nice. And Linda Kachuri, who was here last time I visited, was working there. She, one of the few people who's referenced it, and did this with PSA for predicting prostate cancer. PSA doesn't cause prostate cancer, and it did seem to work. You got a slightly better prediction by removing the genetic component of PSA. Michael.
So when you talked about how you can't not treat severe vitamin D deficiency because of course it's important.
You can't what, say?
When you were talking about how you can't not treat severe vitamin D deficiency because of course it's vital to treat that. It reminded me of a lot of the arguments that were made. So like that you can't do RCTs on it because of that. It reminded me of a lot of arguments from during the pandemic around, well, we can't do RCTs on this or that public health intervention because, of course, we're surgical clot mass. He's a very, very strident critic of a lot of the public health response to COVID. And I'm curious if you anything that
who was a strident? Who was a strident critic?
You.
Who?
You.
Me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Strident. I'm never strident. Come on. Yeah. No.
Anything that I'm saying that in mind.
Yeah.
Is there anything that MR can tell us or around the public health response to COVID or other infections?
That's interesting. So I was criticizing the claims that you couldn't do RCTs in vitamin D. I mean, you wouldn't do it in people who've sort of got rickets or very low vitamin D, but for the large majority of the population, you can do it. The trials who have randomized the large majority of the population don't show any benefit for the major health outcomes. So I think you could have a situation of equipoise for sort of most people. MR on the COVID pandemic. Well, before tocilizumab was used for treating COVID, Michael Holmes and others did a Mendelian randomization study of IL-6 receptor blockade because you have a genetic variant which relates to and mimics tocilizumab, and that the suggestion was that would actually reduce the severe disease and death. So that's an example that it could be done, could definitely be done for treatments, and
anything non-pharmaceutical.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, again, I think there's some situations where it's not Mendelian randomization, but it's using the fact that genes are randomized, but not actually performing sort of formal MR studies. But it was very interesting I was involved in the HGI sort of initiative for the sort of COVID GWAS initiative on the first paper on the right, on the first paper. And what was very interesting there was the polygenic sort of polygenic analyses did give you indications of people at increased risk. You know, I mean, you know, people with you know, ADHD attention deficit score predicted greater risk, for example. So there were things like that might give you some indication of some indication of risk. But I can't see. I'm sure if you actually had taken people during the COVID pandemic, wearing masks and not wearing masks and GWAS them, and as I said, everything is heritable. You would have found some genetic variants that predicted that, but you wouldn't be able to sensibly do MR of that.
I will take the chair's prerogative to ask the last question. So you indicated that some people object to the term Mendelian randomization.
Yeah.
Is that because in general, the community has not shown that there's no transmission ratio distortion, i.e. alleles segregating in the 50-50 ratio?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I don't. I think that's an interesting point, and you know, large trio GWASs are now going on, which are going to document the extent to which that may be, and that's why I think the parent offspring Mendelian randomization, when you can do basically a TDT, that was our model. That was what we thought, but of course it was there just weren't the data. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is this thing that people would say, well, it's neither Mendelian nor is it randomization, and I think that's a misunderstanding. Mendelian, they think you're using it in terms of like Mendelian conditions, whereas by Mendelian we were meaning the Mendelian rules that apply to meiosis, and then. And the second thing is it's not randomization because you've got just population level, you know, population data. I think it's difficult to say if you do have parents and offspring, if you can, you know, that meiosis is pretty close to random, if not being entirely random.
I think we'll end there. Let's thank George. And if you want more questions, George is staying around for the next few minutes.